What's going on YouTube? Counting is back here again. So today we got a video by Real Life Lore. So this one is called Why Ireland Has Fewer People Than 200 Years Ago. Now, from my understanding, guys, Ireland had like 7-8 million people 200 years ago before the famine, and then after the famine it still has less people in Ireland before the famine. So because we had a bunch of people, I don't even know how that many people in Ireland before the famine, but Ireland now has such few people. I think we only hit like 6 million people, 5 million people, I think, something like that. So Ireland's a very, very small country, man. Beautiful country. Living here in Dublin, guys, it seems that the population is growing more and more. Also in Galway, the west coast and east coast is getting a huge population again, especially in Galway, guys. I think the population has freaking tripled in the last 10 years. It's getting crazy. So we're gonna get the explanation why exactly it has happened. So let's get it, man.
The Republic of Ireland today is a pretty small country. Its population of a tad more than 5 million people ranks it as only the 26th largest nation in Europe, or the 122nd largest in the world alongside places like Costa Rica or Kuwait. But the small population base punches well
That's Galway. Shout out Galway, baby.
above its weight, perhaps more than any other country in the world. Though its population is only the 26th largest in Europe, the Irish economy is the 14th largest, and Irish citizens earn the 10th highest incomes on the continent.
Yeah, we're also one of the hardest working countries in the world, guys. Don't forget about that, because a lot of the places most efficiently working, because places like Japan and China have very high work rates, but they actually have low efficiency. You can work all day long, but if your efficiency isn't good, guys, if you're not getting anything done, there's no point even working. So Ireland, we kick ass in that.
The Irish economy is larger and stronger than most bigger nations in the world, as diverse as Nigeria, Romania, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Nonetheless, Ireland should be even stronger and even more developed than it already is. But Ireland, more than any other country in the 21st century world, has a major problem deep within its past that has kept their country from expanding beyond the mere middle power it is in Europe.
Wait, hold on, let's go back, guys.
Country in the 21st century world has a major problem deep within its past that has kept their country from expanding beyond the mere middle power it is in Europe towards the major power that it naturally should be.
Yeah, that problem's called the British, man. Get up!
And that is the fact that Ireland is the only country in the world right now, outside of minor islands and microstates, that has a smaller population today than it did 200 years ago, back in the 19th century. The 21st century Irish are working with a seriously bad historical handicap that continues to limit their island's potential to this day.
Yep.
Take a look at this map. These are the populations of the various countries that made up the United Kingdom 2 centuries ago, back in—
Hold on, we used to have 7 million people in this little island, and England only had 10 million people. Holy shit, that's crazy. Look at England now, though. England has 60 million people. Like, holy shit.
1821, when the entirety of Ireland was beneath British administration. Back then, Ireland's population was largely the same as it is today. 6.8 million then, compared to just over 7 million today when adding in both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland.
Yeah, but we're not adding in those two together, guys.
That might not seem like a really big deal at first thought, but remember that the rest of the world had way, way fewer people back then than it does today. England's population was just 10.4 million then, not that much larger than Ireland's. Egypt's population was only around 4.3 million at the time, compared with over 100 million today, meaning there were more Irish than Egyptians in the early 19th century. And the United States was only home to 9.6 million people at the time, including more than 1.5 million slaves without any citizenship or any rights, meaning there were nearly as many Irish as free Americans. Over the 2 centuries since that census data was recorded, Scotland's population increased by a factor of 2.6, Wales's population by a factor of 4, and England's population by a factor of 5.4.
Whoa.
But Ireland has barely changed at all, and effectively the same number of people live there now as lived 200 years ago.
That's actually crazy.
If Ireland had maintained similar growth rates as the neighboring countries over on Great Britain, like Wales or England, we would expect that the Irish population today would be at least 27 million people or even more.
Bro, that'd be class, man. If we had 36 million people living in Ireland, holy shit. Bro, Galway would be like just jumping, because Galway's already jumping every night, guys, during the week. Dublin too, guys. Dublin's just party central. Could you imagine if we had 36 million? Oh, come on, baby. Bro, we need more immigration, bro, to Ireland. I'd love if Ireland just had 36 million people, man. That'd be unreal.
Potentially even as high as 36 million, if the growth rate had been the same as England's. Either way, that would have made Ireland the 9th most populous nation of Europe today, rather than the 26th, with a number of people more comparable with Poland than with Israel. But that's not what ended up happening, and Ireland today has a missing population of at least 20 million people, who otherwise would have been here were it not for one of, if not the, most traumatic events a major country's population has experienced over the past 200 years. Of course, most people know that Ireland suffered from a catastrophic famine in the 19th century, but I'd bet that a lot of people outside of Ireland don't truly understand the sheer scale of that famine's effects through the centuries into the present.
Guys, go back and watch my reaction to the famine video. That is the most horrifying video. Like, obviously, you guys live in Ireland my whole life. We don't really learn too much about the famine. Like, we learned a little bit in school, but it wasn't portrayed as it is in this video. This video is insane, guys. Just Google County Gaines famine, bro. Horrendous. That is the most horrendous video I've ever seen in my life.
In order to understand how the famine happened in the first place, though, and why its effects were so terrible, it's important to understand a bit of the island's history before it happened. You see, for hundreds of years before the Great Famine struck the country in the 1840s, the Irish population was steadily growing at around the same rate as the rest of Europe was at the time. By 1700, the Irish population was just shy of 3 million people, and then it began growing rapidly from there to more than 5 million just a century later in 1800. As the numbers of Irish began to compound throughout the early 19th century, the island's population quickly surpassed even 8 million people by 1840, a record 266% growth rate in only 140 years. The biggest reason why Ireland's population took off so quickly throughout these years was the first introduction of the potato.
It is.
Bro, potatoes. I just had potatoes for breakfast there, guys. Get your potatoes in. I eat carnivore mainly. Potatoes are good as hell, man.
It was a crop indigenous to the New World, and was thus unknown to the Europeans until the 16th century. It wasn't introduced to Britain or Ireland until the late 1580s, but when it
that's crazy.
It changed both islands' demographic profiles.
It was introduced from like South Ecuador, Brazil, somewhere on the east or west coast of South America?
Forever. The potato yields roughly 3 times the amount of calories per acre as grain, and it's simultaneously more nutritious and grows in more difficult soils and climates, like in Ireland. Ireland became the first region of Europe to cultivate the potato on a large scale in the early 1600s, and it became so successful there, it rapidly accelerated the Irish population's growth rate. A single acre of potatoes and the
more food means more fucking, guys.
Milk of a single cow was sufficient to feed an entire impoverished Irish family, a boring but nutritionally acceptable diet. And as they could be grown almost anywhere, potatoes quickly became the staple crop for the majority of poor Irish families. But the potato's benefits also came with a series of cons. Most catastrophic of them, the Irish began to dangerously increase their dependency on just this one single crop, and worse, a single variety of this single crop, what came to be known as the Irish lumper. This created a serious lack of genetic variability in the potatoes grown in Ireland, which made them far more susceptible to disease. By 1841, the Irish census recorded a population of 8,175,124 people on the island, the highest ever recorded on the island before or since. Just 3 years later, the potato blight came over from the New World to strike down Ireland's primary crop. In 1845, the blight wiped out around a third of the entire potato crop on the island. And
wait, he said the blight came from the New World. That means it came from like the Americas, like the USA maybe?
The blight wiped out around a third of the entire potato crop on the island.
Come here, you want to learn about Irish history?
And then the following year, in 1846,
friggin' Americans, man, Canadians,
it destroyed nearly all of the potatoes in the country. And with the people of Ireland so massively dependent on this one crop, devastating famine quickly ensued. As Ireland wasn't independent during this period and ruled directly from London, British policies only made the crisis worse. Most controversially of all, London refused to ban food exports that were leaving Ireland for Britain as the famine was ongoing and millions were starving to death. At the same time,
we were actually giving our food that we created here in Ireland to the British, like. What the hell? We should have fought back, but we were so malnourished we couldn't, guys.
Tens of thousands of Irish families were denied any form of government relief and evicted from their lands as the famine intensified, because of a law that denied anyone who held at least a quarter acre of land from receiving any relief.
You like those
Ultimately,
potatoes?
this law meant that impoverished Irish farmers who had already sold all of their crops to pay their taxes or their rent, or who had seen all of their potatoes destroyed by the blight, were incapable of applying for any government aid unless
You hear about reparations shit. I need reparations from England for potatoes.
they also gave up their land. This single British government policy forced nearly 200,000 Irish people off of their lands in just 2 years between 1849 and 1850. Within just a few years of the famine beginning in 1845, at least 1 million Irish on the island had died from starvation and malnutrition, representing around 12% of the pre-famine population on the island. But it wasn't just the deaths from the famine that caused Ireland's population to plummet. It was also the millions of additional people who were forced into becoming refugees and left. As you can see by this graph, immigration out of Ireland skyrocketed in 1845, the first really bad year of the famine, and continued remaining outrageously high from the norm before the famine for a decade through to 1855. Between 1845 and 1855, no fewer than 2.1 million people fled Ireland as refugees in one of the
So 1 million people died and 2 million people fled, guys.
greatest exoduses of an island ever in human history, primarily departing for the United States. So enormous was the Irish exodus towards America during this period that for a solid decade between 1850 and 1860, 81% of all the immigrants arriving to the United States were Irish.
And this is why, guys, and this is why I never hate on Americans saying they're Irish, because they are, guys. Because 81% of immigrants coming to Ireland at that time were Irish. Like, that means there's like, I think they said something that's like 10 million people, or 10 million people that have direct links, and 50 million people have indirect links to Irish heritage in America. 50 million people, that's insane, guys.
1860, more than 6% of the entire American population were Irish, who had recently immigrated over just the past decade. When counting in the additional million deaths across this period, the island of Ireland lost well over 3 million people in just a single decade of history between 1845 and 1855, representing a total population crash of nearly 38% of the island's people. That percentage represents one of the most apocalyptic losses of people that any civilization has seen since the indigenous peoples of the Americas across the 16th and 17th centuries. For context, across 6 years of the Second World War and after the invasions of both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, Poland lost around 17% of their population to deaths. And further, the Polish population managed to recover back to its pre-war levels within just 40 years by 1978. More than 180 years now since 1841, Ireland still hasn't managed to recover its pre-famine population. But the famine affected—
Bro, that's crazy. Nearly 200 years after, we still haven't been able to recover the pre-famine population. That's
Ireland
crazy.
in far more ways than in simply numbers.
But we have been able to recuperate that in terms of money, guys. We're one of the richest countries in the world. And also, guys, we have leading the world, even better than America, the #1 source, food security source. So we have the best food security source in the whole world, guys. Google that shit. Compared to even America. America's #2. I mean, it's been impossible to beat America. We actually have beaten them in terms of having the most reliable food source. Like, that's crazy, guys, huh? We'll never have that famine shit again.
The areas of the island that were most severely affected by the famine and depopulation—
Look at my Galway, over 30%, bruh. Shout out to friggin' America for taking all the Galwegians in, bro. Look at that shit. Look, Dublin population rise. Look at Dublin. Because British people started coming in after the famine, and during the famine, like, oh, well, all this free land, everyone's dying. Let me just take some of this shit. You bastards.
were in the West and the South, where the Irish language had previously been more dominant over English. The result of these areas being hit the hardest, accompanied by other linguistic policies from Britain, was the rapid destruction of what remained of the Irish language in Ireland over the next several decades, to the point where by 1900, few Irish-speaking majority areas on the island remained, and by 2000, there were hardly any remaining at all. The depopulation of the West and the South also led to the urbanization and increase in population in the East, around cities like Dublin and Belfast, which remain the first and second largest cities on the island to this day. The famine and its traumatic consequences caused
Bro, I'm getting friggin'
permanent structural and cultural damage to the Irish people that continues on to this day.
Crazy.
The loss of 38% of the population over just 10 years hobbled development and opportunities, and encouraged higher rates of emigration out of the country for nearly every generation that followed. This meant that even after the end of the famine around 1855, high levels of emigration caused by domestic turbulence, violence, and lack of economic opportunities continued putting downward pressure on the island's population for an entire century longer, deep into the 1960s.
That's crazy.
Ireland fought a war for independence from Britain after the conclusion of the First World War, followed by an internal civil war and economic instability, and finally a period of ethno-nationalist and sectarian violence over the political status of Northern Ireland that lasted for decades from the 1960s until the 1990s. All of which heavily discouraged foreign investment. Ireland largely remained an agrarian, unindustrialized, troubled, and relatively impoverished island long after the famine's conclusion, and the population continued to decline throughout the decades, largely due to emigration abroad. By 1890, largely due to emigration abroad. By 1890, decades after the famine had ended, 4 in every 10 Irish-born people were living abroad beyond the island.
Jesus.
And to put it all into even more context, it's currently estimated that roughly 1 in every 2 people born in Ireland across the 19th century would ultimately leave the island for better opportunities abroad. Since
And it's slowly becoming like that again, guys.
1800, it's estimated that more than 10 million people born within Ireland have emigrated to another country beyond the island. More people.
My girl, she's from not Quebec, but near Quebec. 72% Irish, guys. Everyone is Irish in Canada and America. It's crazy.
People then live across Ireland today. Nearly half of those people who left relocated to the United States, where they heavily influenced American culture and society.
These Irish guys.
36 million Americans today, or more than 1 in 10 Americans, and more than 5 times the population of modern Ireland itself, claim Irish as their primary ancestry.
That's crazy.
Across the world, around 80 million people claim a degree of ethnic Irish descent.
So the famine, you know what I mean? We said it's spread now, guys, after the famine. Bro, oh, look at this, man.
For time, the preferred destination of Irish leaving the island gradually shifted away from America and closer to home towards Great Britain, and primarily around the city of Liverpool. In the 1950s, as the agricultural industry continued to decline on the island, unemployment was high and national incomes had only risen by 8% between 1949 and 1956, compared with an average increase of 40% throughout the rest of Europe over that same period. Young Irish adults coming of age in the 1950s knew that better economic opportunities existed outside of their island in nearby locations like Britain. And so, 500,000 of them left the Irish Republic throughout the 1950s as a result, which constituted a further 16% of the Republic's population leaving in just a single decade. And to compound the problem even further, they were mostly young men and women who would have otherwise started families at home and contributed to a growing population and economy. Ireland ended up becoming the only country in Europe, besides Stalinist-ruled East Germany, to actually lose population during the 1950s.
Jesus.
By the time of the Irish census in 1961, the entire island's population was a mere 4.25 million people,
That was
just a
crazy.
little more than half of the population seen 120 years previously at the peak of 1841, immediately before the famine, and the lowest number recorded ever since the census of 1781, nearly 2 centuries beforehand.
Bro, that's
Only after
insane.
then did the island's population finally begin to recover and trend back upwards after more than a century of continuous decline. To the point where today, in 2022, the island's population is back to around 7.1 million people, which is still around 1 million people short of the peak more than 180
We're gonna hit
years
that.
ago, and probably at least 20
I hit
million
that. We're gonna hit that.
people short of where Ireland would have been today without the famine ever taking place. But with so much room left to grow after being held down for so much time, Ireland has only one direction left to go: up. Today, the Republic of Ireland is one of the fastest growing economies anywhere in the world.
Let's go,
The Irish
baby.
economy is currently the fastest growing in Europe,
Yeah.
with a whopping 13.5% increase to
Jeez.
GDP last year in 2021,
dope.
nearly double the economic growth experienced by the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
When factoring out small city-states
Now who's
like
laughing? UK?
Monaco,
Suckers.
Ireland now holds the highest GDP per capita in Europe as well.
Let's go,
with the average
baby.
citizen contributing more to the economy than even famously wealthy nations like Switzerland and Norway.
Let's go,
and,
baby.
perhaps most importantly, the Irish population is now the third fastest growing on the European
we be
continent,
fucking over here,
remaining
too.
only behind the small countries of Luxembourg and Cyprus, and once again, roughly double the population
I've seen-
growth rate currently seen in the United Kingdom.
Let's
If
go,
Ireland's growth
baby.
rate is capable of continuing at this current pace for the foreseeable future, then the island may finally reach its
Shout out Galway
pre-famine
again.
population again by the late 2030s, around 2037. Almost exactly 2 centuries after the famine began.
Yeah.
And from there, Ireland can only continue looking forwards. For my entire life, I've always loved maps. Every video I've ever created on this channel has been based around telling an interesting story.
Alright guys, there you guys have, man. Ireland, shout out Ireland, we're absolute legends. Now, I will say one thing, guys, to conclude this video, man. I will say one thing to conclude this, because that's trending number, I don't know what number it said, the 20th or whatever in the world. I will say one thing, guys. No need to leave Ireland anymore, right? In terms of immigration. Stay here, guys. If you can't make it in your own country, it's tough, guys. It's tough to say that you'll make it somewhere else. I will say one thing, though, guys. Use other American things. I'm using an American platform, for instance. I'm paying taxes in America. I've paid taxes in Ireland my whole life, since I was 18, obviously. Now, I will say that, guys. You know, as Conor McGregor, the man, the absolute ruler of Ireland, Conor McGregor has said, yo, you don't need to leave your country in terms to make a good place. Use other places. Obviously, McGregor wouldn't be shit without the UFC or without, you know, America, obviously, without Floyd Mayweather, stuff like that. Use those guys' things, but bring it back here, guys. Cash that check here. I love you guys all, man, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.